Single mothers aren't raising criminals, poverty is. So there is the myth that the solo mother raises a criminal. That is the sort of myth that is put out by the right. They oftentimes use statistics to say the prison population, etc., many of them were raised by solo mothers, blah, 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 blah. However, the reality is that crime, by its very nature, is universal. So let's get into this. We're going to invoke two thinkers. Number one, Martyr Sigmund Freud. So basically, whether you accept the Oedipus complex and all of that sort of stuff, which is, very complex I can see on the surface why someone would reject it, but there's much more to it. But regardless, the fact of the matter is that Martyr Freud was right about one thing. That is that human beings, for the most part, are guided primarily by the base primal instincts. That is what drives the human animal: the sex drive, hunger, anger, jealousy, rage, pleasure seeking, and so on and so forth. And these are not necessarily bad things either. Of course, they can manifest in terms of crimes of passion and so on and so forth, but they can also manifest as long term marriages and all of this sort of stuff. And so, when we take into account the base primal instincts of the human animal, as evidenced by crimes of passion and, the grooming of individuals that are underage and so on and so forth, we see that such crimes are evenly dispersed more or less. One of the sort of things that I often like to say is that there are two myths. Number one, that serial killers are white, and number two, that drug dealers are Maori. So let's get into the other element about crime. So, crimes that do not concern the base primal instincts, okay? Let's get into that. The reality is that all classes engage in crime when you think about it. For example, the middle and upper classes tend to engage in wage theft. You see what I'm saying? Or loan fraud, things like this, or tax evasion. Whereas those of the working class and lower class, the proletariat and lumpen proletariat, will often engage in, bootlegging, robberies, and so on and so forth. So, what does this tell us? This tells us that the material interests of human beings are sacrosanct, as talked about by Marshall Marx himself, who talked about the notion of social reproduction. What is that? Basically, the way social reproduction works is that I might value morally playing a guitar and meditating all day, right? That might be what I value morally. But the reality is that I need a home, food, and so on and so forth, let alone a guitar, in order to be able to sit around all day playing guitar and meditating, if that makes sense. And so, whether we like it or not, sooner or later, at some point, our material interests are always going to come first. This is evidence within the capitalist system that those of certain classes engage in certain crimes. And so, what we see is that the best predictors for crime is not to do with solo mothers or whatever kind of familial arrangement one may or may not have. The best predictors are, in fact, class, not that it will produce a criminal, but the kind of criminal that will be produced. And number two, geography. Why geography? Well, very simple, because bootlegging might be profitable in the countryside, whereas straight up drug dealing is going to be more profitable in the city. And so when we look at this honestly and we truly interrogate the data at hand, we realize that the right is deeply dishonest about the nature of things and that it is not solo mothers that are to blame for crime.